Just thought I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse, right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years, before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another, an even larger trunk on its way down, now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree, and then steadied myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top, because it just got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out about how high up I was. One day I was sitting on my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. "Hey kid." I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but I couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I just imagined hearing a man's voice at all. "I know you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up a log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The bird song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of a human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all just my imagination, by leaning over the edge as far as I possibly could, without slipping off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth. When suddenly, "Come down here, or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud it was as if I was being screamed at right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for an awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I'd never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling up rapidly towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and the occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling and crying, at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother. In time I somehow recovered, exhibiting the naive hard skin of a child, although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approaching that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk, when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you've ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you'll know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all of the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting pretty dark and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and the senses that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mom would make. I rationalized to keep me from getting lost. So foolishly, I followed the direction set by the green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small sloppily written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of a collapsed trunk and a leaf litter. At this point it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for trace, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across a third green note which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out of these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into my veins within my arm. I got a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which look fresh and without sign of decay, despite the previous week's non-stop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silent, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickles of noise in the mist. For a long time I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading the horrible note over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note in big green letters was my name, It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped the back of my neck, like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into my bed, where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at the damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had. Although we mutually shared the peculiar oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us, and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out into the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from my mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded, "No," though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m. when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and to not, by any means, dare go home. I remember those bleak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop my bags off, but Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all the color had drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor, after flinching at the cat brushing her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandmother was sound asleep, that she told me what had happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old Grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul. This was what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, as she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire. Curtains opened to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping noises near her head, at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often got at the place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noise started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw the rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest's edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush, and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where the heavy ones had hit, right beside her, where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window, as she saw me, standing half behind a tree, near the window. Grinning wide and staring at her, one of my visible eyes stretched open wide, showing all the white. She barely stifled a scream seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move nor blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting out of the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face unceasingly continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence the letter texts, my mom shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the trees just started moving, as if it were mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree, my mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to the bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said, she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door, where an awful, white face could be seen, staring right at her. Its mouth contorting and gaping what sounded like high sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter away from my mother. It started to open slowly. An unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards, before finally getting out, running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car, and driving off. She said that as she glanced back, right at the end of the prolonged driveway, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her car got further and further away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never did step foot in that place again. As my mother told the story, she broke down in tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. Honestly, I fully believe that she experienced what she says she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house once and for all. I only went back once, with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with what was all left inside. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish we could say that there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to get out of there. There are, however, two things left worth mentioning. 1. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including the one in my bedroom and kitchen, had been smashed, and rocks were lying on the floor. 2. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked me how long we had had that swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never owned a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the weeks that we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the falling log that I stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously new rope and nicely polished, sanded down wood set at the seat of the base. Dad wanted to keep my mind from recent events. He doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable. He said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing that it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we had literally no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in that place at all, and never in that time living there did I ever see other signs of human habitation. But I let it all go. I was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what had happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while, I couldn't. Seeing as it's Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son. Shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what had happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles, obliviously, towards it. King Island loomed out of the mist like a ghostly lookout in the middle of the Bering Sea. The island, barely a mile wide and a mile long, was a rugged outcrop of steep slopes and jagged cliffs. Perched precariously on the cliffs was a village of stilted huts, abandoned for over 50 years. The village, once home to the Alaskan, now stood as a skeletal remnant of a long-gone era, its structures creaking in the wind, and its pathways overgrown with a tangle of hardy vegetation. The complete isolation of King Island was precisely what had drawn Michael Pay, a seasoned urban explorer and a popular YouTuber, to its shores. Michael had built a substantial following by documenting the forgotten corners of the world, places where history and decay intertwine to tell silent, haunting stories. King Island, with its unique history and haunting desolation, was a perfect addition to his channel. It was strictly against the rules, but he was determined to stay overnight, capturing footage what would memorize his audience and cement his reputation as a fearless explorer. As the daily tourist boat approached the island, Michael stood at the bow, his camera already recording the approach. The tourists around him chattered excitedly, their voices a stark contrast to the overwhelming silence of the island. The guide's voice echoed through a megaphone, recounting the history of the Asalek and the village's abandonment, but Michael barely listened. He had done his research into this place, and his mind was already focused on the night ahead. The boat docked at a small rickety pier, and the tourists disembarked, their cameras clicking as they took in the haunting scenery. Michael hung back though, his heart pounding with feelings of excitement and trepidation. He watched as the tourists were shepherded around by the guide, their visit limited to a relatively few save spots. When the time came for the group to return to the boat, Michael discreetly slipped away, hiding behind one of the stilted huts until the sound of the boat's engine faded into the distance. Now alone on King Island, Michael felt an uncomfortable chill, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. The island seemed to breathe around him, its silence suddenly profound, and yet also suffocating. He glanced at his watch. It was just past noon. He had several hours of daylight left to explore and document the village before nightfall. Slinging his backpack over his shoulder, he set off up the steep slope, his camera capturing every creak of wood and rustle of wind-blown grass. For Michael, the true adventure had now begun, and yet, he had no idea of the terror that awaited him in the darkness. As dusk settled over King Island, the final rays of sunlight painted the abandoned village in hues of deep orange and shadowy blue. Michael had spent the afternoon methodically exploring and recording the empty huts and narrow pathways. Now, with the boat back to the mainland long departed, he was truly alone. He chose a relatively intact hut perched on the steep slope for his base camp, its weathered wood and rusted nails offering a semblance of shelter against the encroaching night. He set up his gear meticulously, arranging his camera equipment to capture a 360-degree view of the hut's interior. As the darkness deepened, Michael turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the thickening gloom. He spoke into his camera, narrating his thoughts and observations about the ghostly silence and the desolate beauty of this place. His voice sounded unnaturally loud against the backdrop of the island's quiet. With the camera running, Michael ventured outside to continue his exploration, under the cover of night. The village felt different in the dark, more sinister, as if the shadows themselves were alive. As he walked, he noticed the wind had picked up, creating an eerie symphony as it whistled through the stilts and cracked wooden beams. Then came the first noise, a faint rhythmic tapping, like the sound of a footstep on a wooden plank. Michael froze, his flashlight beam darting towards the source of the noise. He saw nothing but the empty village, the windswept paths, and the ghostly silhouettes of the huts. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just the wind playing tricks on his mind. Michael swung around, his flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying. The beam fell on a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. His heart pounded as he squinted, trying to make out the features of the figure. But in the blink of an eye, it was gone, leaving only the swaying grass and the echo of his heartbeat. Returning to the hut, Michael felt the first pangs of true fear. He reviewed his footage, hoping to find a rational explanation. But the camera only showed what he had seen: an empty village, a desolate clearing, and a fleeting shadow. The hut's creaking grew louder, more persistent, like the steady drip of water from a faucet, and Michael could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread. As he settled into his sleeping bag, the wind outside seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible. The hut groaned and creaked around him, each noise amplified in the silence. He tried to rationalize it as the natural sounds of an old structure, but deep down, he knew something was very wrong. The island was not as abandoned as it seemed, and the spirits of the ancient people, restless and angry, were making their presence known. Sleep was elusive as Michael lay there, eyes wide open, every muscle on his body tense. He realized that he was not alone on King Island, and whatever was out there in the dark was watching and waiting. The first signs of haunting had made themselves known, and his stay on the desolate island was far from over. Dawn eventually arrived on King Island, but the sunlight did little to dispel the lingering sense of unease. Michael awoke from a restless sleep, his mind still haunted by the inexplicable sounds and shadows of the night before. Determined to uncover the island's secrets, he packed his gear and set out to explore more of the village in the stark light of day. As he navigated the narrow, overgrown paths, Michael stumbled upon an old communal area. The remains of a large fire pit, surrounded by weathered totems and carvings, hinted at the rich cultural civilization that once thrived here. Intricate markings, some almost faded beyond recognition, decorated the totems, telling stories that Michael could only guess at. He documented everything with meticulous care, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. The day passed in a blur of discoveries and mounting tension. The more Michael uncovered, the more the island seemed to respond. Objects began to move on their own, a stone rolling across the floor, a door creaking open without a breeze to move it. Whispers filled the air, barely audible, elusive and just beyond the range of comprehension. At times, he swore he caught glimpses of figures out of the corner of his eye, but they vanished the moment he turned to look. As evening approached, Michael retreated to the hut to review his footage and conduct some research on the Asulik tribe. Using a satellite internet connection, he delved into the historical records and the anthropological studies. He learned that the Asulik had lived on King Island for generations, thriving in their unique and challenging environment. However, the records grew vague and unsettling when describing the tribe's sudden departure. According to local folklore and a number of academic sources, the Asulik had been driven away by the spirits of an even older civilization. These ancient spirits, it was said, were powerful and hostile, and had been angry at the intrusion of the living on their sacred land. The tribe's shaman had reportedly tried to appease the spirits with rituals and offerings, but in the end, the Asulik had no choice but to abandon their island, leaving their homes and possessions behind. This realization hit Michael hard. The spirits he had sensed were not just figments of his imagination, or mere remnants of the past. They were real, and dangerously active. As the sun again dipped below the horizon, plunging the island into darkness once more, the paranormal activity escalated to a terrifying level. The whispers grew louder and more coherent, forming disjointed phrases in a language Michael could not understand. Shadows flitted across the walls, sometimes taking on humanoid shapes that seemed to reach out to him. Objects flew across the room with violent force, and the temperature plummeted, making his breath visible in the frigid air. Michael's camera, which he had left running in the corner of the hut, captured everything. The whispers, the shadows, even the flying objects. He knew he had irrefutable evidence of the haunting, evidence that could propel his YouTube fame to new heights, but the triumph of that realization was overshadowed by sheer terror. He no longer was just an observer. Now, he was a target. Outside, the wind howled, and the hut's aging structure groaned under the pressure of the unseen forces. Michael knew he was running out of time. With trembling hands, he began to set up a makeshift altar using the artifacts he had found, hoping against hope that he could survive until the boat returned the next day. His second night here was far from over, and the spirits of King Island were closing in. The midnight air on King Island was thick with unnatural chill, as if the island itself had been plunged into an abyss of despair. Michael's makeshift altar stood in the center of the hut, the artifacts arranged with a desperate hope that they might placate the vengeful spirits. But as he knelt before it, clutching the ceremonial mask, the atmosphere inside the hut grew increasingly oppressive. Without warning, a deafening crash reverberated through the hut. The walls shuddered as an unseen malevolent force battered them from all sides. Michael scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, as a ghostly figure materialized in front of him. It was a translucent vision of an ancient shaman, eyes burning with an ethereal fire. The spirit's mouth moved, emanating a guttural chant that resonated deep within Michael's bones. Before he could react, the shaman raised a spectral hand, and Michael was thrown backward by an invisible force. He crashed into the far wall, pain radiating throughout his body. The mask slipped from his grasp, skidding across the floor. Struggling to breathe, he watched in horror as the room filled with more ghostly apparitions. Men, women, and children of the ancient tribe, their faces contorted with anger and sorrow. The spirits moved with purpose, their collective rage directed at Michael. Objects in the hut levitated and hurtled towards him, barely missing their mark. He ducked and dodged, each near miss intensifying his fear. His initial curiosity about the haunting had morphed into sheer terror. The realization that he was no longer an observer, but a target, fully sank in. Desperation clawed at his mind as he tried to formulate an escape plan. He grabbed his flashlight and darted out of the hut, the beams of the light flickering erratically. The village outside was a maze of shifting shadows and supernatural glowing figures. Every direction seemed fraught with danger, but he knew he couldn't possibly stay in the hut. His thoughts raced as he considered his options. The boat would return at dawn, but that was hours away. He was trapped on the island, with no immediate means of escape. The only chance he had was to survive until daylight. He remembered the old fire pit and the communal area he'd found earlier. Perhaps he could use the open space to his advantage, keeping the spirits at bay long enough to endure the night. As he ran through the village, the spirits pursued him relentlessly. Their whispers grew into a cacophony of wails and chants, their forms flickering in and out of existence. One spirit, more corporeal than the others, reached out and clawed at his arm. Pain had shot through him as if he had been burned. He stumbled but forced himself to keep moving, adrenaline surging through his veins. Finally, he reached the clearing with the fire pit. He dropped to his knees and hastily gathered kindling and wood, praying that a fire might provide some kind of protection. His hands trembled as he struck a match, the tiny flame offering a glimmer of hope. After a short while, he managed to get a small fire going, the flickering flames casting long shadows around the clearing. For a moment, the spirits seemed to hesitate, their forms wavering at the edge of the firelight. Michael took the opportunity to catch his breath, taking stock of the reality of his situation. He was alone, outmatched and surrounded by hostile forces he barely understood. The curiosity that had driven him to explore King Island now felt like a cruel joke, replaced by a primal fear for his life. The spirits quickly regrouped, their resolve unbroken. They began to circle the fire, their chants growing louder, more insistent. Michael knew the fire wouldn't hold them off forever. As he stared into the flames, he recalled the rituals and offerings mentioned in his research. He needed to perform some form of appeasement, but he had no idea how, or if it would even work. With no other options, he grabbed the ceremonial mask from his backpack and placed it on his face, hoping it would grant him some connection to the spirits. He mimicked the shaman's chants he had heard earlier, his voice trembling. The spirits paused, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. For a brief, hopeful moment, the island seemed to hold its breath. But then the shaman's spirit stepped forward, raising its hand once more. The fire blazed higher, and the ground beneath Michael's feet began to shake. He realized with dawning horror that his attempt at appeasing had only enraged them further. As the spirits closed in, Michael's fear reached its peak. He was out of time and options, facing the full wrath of the island's ancient inhabitants. His only hope now was to somehow endure the night and pray for dawn's arrival when the boat would return and offer a chance at escape. The second night on King Island had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Michael clung to the hope that he could survive until dawn, but the spirit showed no signs of abating. As he huddled by the fire, the shaman's spirit slowly advanced, its spectral form pulsating with a malevolent energy. The other spirits closed in as well, their chants reaching a fever pitch. Michael's mind raced as he tried to think of a strategy. His urban exploration skills had taught him to navigate any number of dangerous, unstable environments, and he knew he had to use those skills now. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight of his life. Grabbing his flashlight and camera, he made a sudden dash away from the fire, heading towards the cliffs on the far side of the village. The spirits followed, their wrath tangible in the air. The ground beneath Michael's feet seemed to tremble with each step, and the whispers and wails of the spirits filled his ears, almost drowning out his own thoughts. He navigated the narrow paths and unstable ground with precision, avoiding pitfalls and crumbling structures. His flashlight beam bounced erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced and swirled around him. As he climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling through the cliffs and adding to the cacophony of noise. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with exertion. He knew he couldn't keep up this pace for long, but stopping was not an option. He glanced at his watch. Dawn was still hours away. He needed to buy himself more time. Reaching a high vantage point, Michael paused to catch his breath and reassess his situation. Below, the spirits swarmed the village, their glowing forms like a sea of angry fireflies. He could see the faint outline of the shore in the distance, where the boat would arrive with the first light of day. It was his only chance, but the path down was treacherous and filled with the restless dead. Suddenly, the shaman's spirit appeared in front of him, its eyes burning with an intense, otherworldly light. Michael stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. The spirit raised its arms, and the air around Michael grew thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was trying to crush him. Gasping for breath, he realized he had to confront the shaman if he hoped to make it to the shore. Drawing on every ounce of courage, Michael stood his ground. He remembered the chants he had mimicked earlier and began to repeat them, his voice trembling but growing steadily with each word. The shaman's spirit hesitated, its form flickering. Encouraged, Michael continued, his voice rising above the howling wind and the spirit's wails. The shaman let out an unearthly scream, and Michael felt a force slam into him, knocking him to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to get up. He couldn't give in now. With a final desperate push, he shouted the last lines of the chant, his voice breaking the spectral tension around him. For a moment, everything went still. The spirits paused, their forms wavering. The shaman's eyes locked into Michael's, and he felt a strange connection, as if the spirit was seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. Then, with a burst of light, the shaman vanished, and the other spirits began to fade, their energies dissipating into the night. But the danger wasn't over, and Michael knew the spirits could return at any moment. He seized the opportunity and began his descent towards the shore. The path was steep and slippery, and he had used every bit of his agility and knowledge to avoid falling. The first hints of dawn were beginning to color the sky, casting a pale light over the island. As he neared the bottom, the spirits reappeared, more aggressive than ever. They surged towards him, their forms coalescing into a wall of spectral rage. Michael pushed himself harder, his legs burning with exhaustion, his mind a blur of fear and determination. The sound of the boat's horn in the distance spurred him on. Finally, he burst through the last of the undergrowth, the rocky shore now within running distance. The boat was approaching, its lights cutting through the early morning mist. Michael waved frantically, his voice hoarse as he shouted for help. The spirits were closing in, their whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. He knew he had survived a night of unimaginable horror, but the experience had left its mark. The footage he had captured would prove the existence of the supernatural, but at a cost he had never anticipated. The island's secrets had nearly claimed his life, and if he was to successfully escape, he knew that their whispers would haunt him forever. As the first light of dawn finally pierced through the dense fog, Michael reached the shore, his body bruised and battered, his spirit frayed by the night's harrowing ordeal. The sound of the spirits' whispers were now a deafening roar behind him, urging him to run faster to escape their wrath. He stumbled over the rocky terrain, each step fueled by sheer desperation. Just as he feared the spirits would catch him, the tourist boat's horn blared in the distance. The vessel's light cut through the mist, a beacon of salvation. Michael waved his arms frantically, his shouts for help merging with the cries of the spirits. The The crew on the boat spotted him, and the boat made a swift turn towards the shore. As Michael neared the edge of the water, the spirits surged forward, their forms more solid and menacing than ever. But as the boat approached, the spirits recoiled, unable to follow him any further. An invisible barrier seemed to hold them back, their glowing eyes burning with frustration and anger. They hovered at the shore, their wails rising to a fever pitch before they began to dissolve in the light of the rising sun. The boat crew threw a rope ladder over the side, and Michael grabbed it with shaking hands, climbing aboard with the last of his strength. He collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The crew surrounded him, their faces etched with concern and confusion. "Are you alright, buddy?" one of the crew members asked him, kneeling beside him. Michael struggled to sit up, his voice hoarse and weak. "You have to believe me," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The island, it's haunted. The spirits, they tried to kill me." The crew exchanged skeptical glances. The captain, a grizzled man with a weathered face, stepped forward. "You must have had one hell of a couple of nights," he said, his tone dismissive. "These old places can play tricks on the mind, especially when you're out there alone." "No, you don't understand," Michael insisted, his eyes wide with urgency. "I have proof. The spirits, they were real. I have it all on camera." The crew members helped him to a bench, offering him water and a blanket. Despite his frantic explanations, they seemed to attribute his fear to the isolation and stress of spending 2 nights on the deserted island. They murmured soothing words, assuring him he was safe now, but their expressions remained doubtful. Having taken a roll call of passenger numbers, they have eventually realized that Michael was missing. Consequently, the tourist trip had been canceled for the day, while they attempted to find him, if necessary, and bring him back to the mainland. As the boat pulled away from King Island, Michael looked back one more time. The spirits had faded into the morning light, leaving only the desolate village behind. The haunting cries and ghostly figures were gone, but their presence lingered in his mind. He knew what he had experienced was real, and the footage on his camera would prove it. Yet, as he clutched the camera to his chest, he realized that convincing others of the truth would be an entirely different battle. The boat's engine hummed steadily as they made their way back to the mainland. Michael closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. He had narrowly escaped with his life, but the memories of King Island would haunt him forever. Back on the mainland, Michael retreated to the familiarity of his small rented apartment, still reeling from the nightmarish events on King Island. His body bore the bruises and scratches of his encounter with the spirits, but it was the scars on his mind that weighed heaviest. He knew for certain that he had captured everything on camera. The whispers, the apparitions, the terrifying manifestations of the spirits. But as he sat down to review the footage, a gnawing fear crept over him. This footage would send him into the YouTube stratosphere if it had captured his ordeal fully. With trembling hands, he plugged in his camera and opened the files. To his astonishment, the footage played smoothly, every moment vivid and clear, as if he were reliving the night all over again. The camera had caught the eerie glow of the spirits, their ethereal forms moving with the haunting rays. The whispers echoed through the speakers, sending a chill down his spine, even in the safety of his apartment. Michael felt emotions of relief and dread. He now had undeniable proof of the paranormal activities on King Island, footage that could potentially validate his terrifying experience. But as he contemplated sharing the footage with the world, a series of strange occurrences began to unfold around him. It started with subtle noises, a faint tapping on the windows, whispers that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. Michael dismissed them at first, attributing them to nerves and exhaustion. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more pronounced. Objects moved on their own. A chair scraped across the floor when he turned his back. A picture frame tilted askew, without explanation. The air in his apartment felt heavy, as if charged with an unseen presence. Michael's sleep became fitful, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and echoing chants. He knew that the spirits had not stayed behind on King Island. They had followed him, their presence lingering like a dark cloud over his life. Fear gnawed at him day and night, his once passionate pursuit of urban exploration, now tainted by the specter of the supernatural. He hesitated to release the footage on YouTube, unsure of the consequences it might bring. Would sharing the proof of the spirit's existence invite more torment, more relentless haunting? In a moment of desperate clarity, Michael decided. He deleted the footage, erasing all the evidence of his ordeal on King Island. It was perhaps a futile attempt to appease the spirits, to erase any trace of their presence from his life. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The spirits had marked him, and they would not rest until they had exacted their toll. As he sat alone in the darkened apartment, haunted by the memories of King Island and the unseen forces that now surrounded him, Michael realized the true twist of his story. The spirits had won. They had not only driven him to the edge of terror, but had followed him back to ensure he would never forget the price of trespassing into their realm. And so, Michael Pay, once a fearless explorer of abandoned places, slowly became a prisoner of his own fear, forever haunted by the spirits of King Island, and the chilling truth that some ghosts never truly leave the places they haunt, while others never leave those that trespass their home. I try to live my life without too many regrets. I've had highs and lows like everyone else, sure, but I do what I can not to worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. I figure everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what-ifs is ridiculous, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. Hindsight is perfect, and even then, you can never be sure exactly what the sequences of events might have looked like if you'd gone right instead of left. And yet there is one choice I made, one road I took that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I only done something different. My job has me move around pretty regularly. I'm not going to get into what I do, it has no bearing on the story. But a couple years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and since this was the closest I'd been to home since I'd moved down to college, I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I'd be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger, so I tried to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I'd been thinking about it when I was looking for a place to rent, I'd probably try to live on the west side of Philadelphia, instead of in New Jersey, to avoid the traffic during rush hour. But by the time I realized it, the lease was signed, and there was not much that I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring, honestly. I'd take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then embark on a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania, on I-80, before another hour north on I-79 to Erie, Pennsylvania, where I'm from. The only variance in the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on 476 extension, I could typically predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. For my second summer in Jersey, I'd taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week in Erie. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm blew through and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no air conditioning wasn't something I particularly felt like spending the first half of my vacation doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know I'd be heading over a few days early. In retrospect, I should have left the first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple things to take care of before heading out. By the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on toward mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was particularly heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my normal timeline, I figured I'd still be able to make it in early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before crashing in for the night. Two things I hadn't taken into consideration were the number of other folks that apparently had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and the road construction that must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65, 70, or in some remote places like West Texas, even faster, making a cross-country automobile travel take a fraction of the hours it would take otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks have reminisced about the days before the interstate, when going to see your friends outside of DC would almost take twice as long as it does now. What is truly remarkable to me, though, is that even though the entire system of highways were built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was uncharacteristically heavy, but moving. I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that our 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. Hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, and see I certainly could, as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I've ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved a mile an hour. About after 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead, and no end in the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic miraculously picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me, so at that point I knew for sure it was going to be a pretty late night that I was getting in. After finished eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles, but then I came up to the back end of the jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google Maps could clue me in on any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports have shown that people would rather walk farther to the baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less, if they have had a slightly longer wait at the plane side. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor, though I-80 still showed as a dark red band for another 50 miles or so. There was a southbound county road coming up just in a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that, either of which looked like they'd let me pass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out. I opted to take the southbound road even though the app told me it would ultimately take 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house. I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than 30 minutes difference to get the northbound route anyways. And that is a choice that will haunt me until the day I die. I made the turn off and immediately felt my mood improve. The signs altered, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour, but even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road started a little twisty, with plenty of elevation changes as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest diagonal, but turned and double-backed on itself enough for the first 30 minutes or so. I got regular views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that, though, Just about the time the sun was dipping beneath the couple of hills on my rearview mirror, the road took a long curving tack and carried me down a way and out of the sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. Sure, there are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is deceptively big, and it's remote. Isolated. Hell, the translation of the name means Penn's Woods after all. The Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any direction without seeing anything like another human being. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams. But away from those centers of development, the Harrisburgs and the Pottsvilles and the Scrantons and what have you, there's a whole lot of nothing. Nothing in trees. And dark and lonely road. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot, I mentioned. Traveled through most of the continental states anyway. I sometimes used to wonder, when I'd be driving along a patch of asphalt surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to construct such a road. What had it been like before men had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What had lived out there? I don't wonder anymore, not since that night when I went left instead of right. The way continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I wound deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up and blocked out much of the view of the sky and stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because of the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever had built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for, and I found myself gradually straddling the faded double yellow partition running down the middle of the two lanes to keep some distance between myself and the trees that increasingly encroached the pavement's edge. I've never been a particularly good navigator. My parents used to say it was because I spent my childhood with my nose pushed into a book during car rides, but I personally just think it's because I'm bad at it. So despite there being no possible way I could be lost, as there were no other roads I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track, I more and more frequently found myself checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at 0 for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I should have some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for probably the 20th time I was still good on my route choice, and after my brain took a beat to process that what I was rapidly approaching was a vehicle, stopped in the middle of the lane and slapped my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all of his lights were off. If I hadn't had my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him before I practically was on top of him, even if I hadn't been checking my phone. I could feel my pulse beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody particularly prone to road rage, and after a couple of quick breaths, I managed to get a hold of myself. Not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle, I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my hazards on. That was when I started noticing a few odd things about the stopped car, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was halted directly in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder to speak of that a driver could have moved onto. The strange thing, though, was that all the doors were open. Those on the driver's side even crossed slightly into the oncoming traffic light. And upon further observation, I saw an item dropped onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child-stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would go against my better judgment, keep on my merry way, and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier that my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my decisions too harshly, it bears mentioning that I've spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel that I could handle myself. And so I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I kept there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to spy signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. "Hello?" I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left towards the middle of the road, so I'd be able to get a look inside before I got too close. "Anyone there?" No answer. The beams from my headlights helped some, but there were still enough shadows to obscure the car's interior. Shining my flashlight easily determined that no one was inside though. I moved closer, stooping down by the rear door to pick up the fallen object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just as I had suspected. A stuffed rabbit with well-worn patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched a ride with a passerby, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have thrown a conniption. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That meant it couldn't have been here terribly long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key, and the ignition started right up. Headlights and the dome light in the roof sprung to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Curiouser and curiouser. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up. A normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. It had about $40 in cash, a couple of credit cards, a gym membership, and a Sam's Club card. The driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. A couple pictures showed Mary in staged poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree, the leaves of which were red and yellow, captured in the thrall of autumn. A huge bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind. A small ponytail girl with a goofy, over-exaggerated smile on her lap. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with the situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat, turned off the car, and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911. Holding it over my head to try to get a connection. No luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet though, the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at the flattened foliage, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts teetered back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I'd been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere, in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the beaten path. That's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight's beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally. Her arms swayed out of sync with the rest of her body, like a marionette manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. Anyone there? More shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband. There, her little daughter, owner of the well-loved rabbit. Both naked. Both moving as oddly as their wife and mother. And now I could tell that there were more. Many more. Their forms indistinct out of the direct light, but so many. They caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their odd, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. "Hello?" they called. "Anyone there?" Parroting back the question I asked only a few short minutes ago, when I'd approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching automatons, tripping into the walker's car. Catching my balance, I involuntarily shone my light up to the pitch recesses of the branches, and in doing so, could just make out barely a sort of darkness crouched hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from the concealed mass and seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker, her kin and the countless other shapes moving in concert with them. "Hello? Anyone there?" I sprinted then, back to my car, engine mercifully still running, headlights and hazards flashing welcomely. "Hello?" I shifted to reverse, miraculously keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. "Anyone there?" I chanced a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood halted, just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, beckoning me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents, letting them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I was about to call 911, but I didn't. What would I have told them? And to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what ifs, but this one, this choice. What if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I still would have gone left. Maybe I would have been there in the time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing, fishing in the dark. What if I'd gone right? Would I still be ignorantly going through life, unknowing there are other things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, my thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had it clutched to my hand. I used to wonder, before men brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? I don't wonder anymore. I can't afford to, at least if I don't want to wake up screaming. And no matter how bad the traffic is, I always stick to the interstate.